In September 1178, a French master mason named William of Sens stood on a wooden scaffold roughly 50 feet above the new choir of Canterbury Cathedral. He was inspecting a vault his crew had just keyed into place. The scaffold gave way. William fell onto the stone pavement below. The chronicler Gervase of Canterbury recorded the moment in the cathedral's own history. William survived the fall. His back did not. He directed the rest of the work from a bed for nearly a year, sending instructions through a deputy, before finally giving up and being carried back to France to die. He was the most celebrated cathedral architect of his generation, summoned across the Channel after Canterbury's old choir burned in 1174. But he ended up on a stretcher because the wooden scaffold on his own building failed. Subscribe and comment for more medieval videos. This is what it actually cost to build the cathedrals of medieval Europe. Not just decades of labor and tons of silver, but lives. Dozens at a time on every major project that ever rose above 100 feet. Today we walk through the brutal life of the medieval stonemason, the 14-year-old apprentice, the master who could draw a 400-foot spire with a rope and a pair of compasses, and the guild that disappeared in a single generation when the king stopped paying. The medieval stonemason did not call himself a stonemason, he called himself a freemason, a worker of free stone, the soft limestone that could be carved with a chisel instead of just split with hammers. By the year 1300, the Freemason was the highest-paid skilled tradesman in Northern Europe outside of armed men. A master at York or Salisbury in the late 1300s could pull around 8 pence a day, at a time when an English farm laborer earned 1.5 pence. He ate meat at the lodge table. He owned a personal set of tools that he had cut his own mark into. He was housed by the cathedral while the project ran, and he could cross borders that would have gotten any other peasant arrested for leaving his parish. But to earn any of that, he had to start at 14. The apprentice was contracted to a master for a fixed term, usually between 5 and 7 years. During those years, he received no wages. He received food, a place to sleep on the lodge floor, and the right to be taught. In exchange, he gave the master his entire labor. He carried stones. He fetched water. He held templates while the master cut. He swept the cutting floor at the end of every day. A mason's apprentice at Strasbourg in the 14th century was forbidden from leaving the city without written permission from his master. He could not marry. He could not strike a deal of his own. He could not even possess his own tools. Those belonged to the lodge, and they were issued at the start of every shift and counted back in at the end of it. The first year of an apprenticeship was not stonework, it was tool work. The boy learned to forge his own chisels from iron blanks supplied by the lodge smith. He learned to set the cutting edge at the right angle for limestone, a sharper angle for sandstone, and the bluntest for granite. He learned to hold a mallet for 10 hours without his shoulder failing. He learned which stones to step on, which to avoid, and what a hairline crack sounded like under a tap test. In the second year, he was allowed to dress rough blocks, squaring them, truing the faces, cutting bedding joints to a flat plane that would sit tight against another block. The work was monotonous, but it was the foundation of everything that came after. A mason who could not square a block could not be trusted with anything else ever. By year 3, he was cutting molded stones from full-size templates handed to him by the master. The templates were drawn on a tracing floor, a flat plaster surface laid on the lodge floor and re-leveled every few months. The York Minster tracing floor still survives. From the lines drawn on that plaster, wooden templates were cut. And from the wooden templates, every voussoir, every mullion, every ribstone in the cathedral was shaped on the ground before being lifted into place. By year 4, the apprentice was working on profile moldings, the cornices, the window tracery, the decorative elements that distinguish the banker mason, a craftsman skilled enough to be trusted with finished surfaces, from the hewer, who would only ever work rough stone for the rest of his life. In year 5, after his master signed off, the apprentice cut his own mark into a stone for the first time. The mark was his signature, his personal symbol. From that day forward, every stone he shaped for any cathedral on the continent carried it. A 1306 contract between Richard of Stowe and the Dean and Chapter of Lincoln Cathedral lays out exactly how this worked. Plain walling stones were paid by measured length, identified at the wall by the mason's mark cut into them. A University of Warwick research project has documented thousands of these marks across surviving English cathedrals. If a stone failed, the lodge knew whose work it was. If a stone held for 800 years, the lodge knew that too. But the apprentice was not finished. After 5 years on one site, he was required by the lodge to undertake a wanderjar, a full year of travel between lodges. He carried a sealed letter from his master and walked from city to city, stopping at each lodge for days or weeks at a time, working under the local master to learn the regional techniques. A mason from Strasbourg might walk to Vienna, then to Cologne, then to Basel, picking up a new approach to rib vaulting at every stop. He slept where the road let him sleep. He ate where the lodge fed him. He learned what no master in his home city could teach him. And only after the wanderjar was complete and witnessed could he be promoted to journeyman. And finally, after years more of proven work, to master. The institution that held the chain together was called a lodge. It was the most strictly regulated workplace in medieval Europe. Here is the part the modern engineering world still cannot fully reproduce. The medieval mason did not work from numerical drawings. He worked from geometry. There was no standardized unit of measurement that crossed borders. The foot in Paris was different from the foot in London. The L in Strasbourg was different from the L in Vienna. And yet cathedrals built 500 miles apart share exact proportional relationships. The method was called ad quadratum. The master mason laid out a base square with a rope, a peg, and a pair of compasses. To generate the next proportional module, he rotated the square 45 degrees and inscribed a new square whose sides ran through the midpoints of the first. The ratio between those two squares is 1 to the square root of 2. Stack that module up, the elevation of the building and the entire cathedral emerges from pure geometry without anyone measuring a specific length. A second method worked from the equilateral triangle, ad triangulum, height to width, ratio of 1 to the square root of 3 halves. In 1391, the Lombard masters laying out Milan Cathedral hit a problem. Their ad quadratum ground plan generated a height that could not be cleanly resolved ad triangulum. So they summoned a mathematician from Piacenza named Gabriele Stonaloco. His written opinion, delivered on the 13th of October, 1391, rounded the theoretical height of 83.138 units to 84 units, so it could be divided cleanly into 6 modules of 14. That document is the earliest written record we have of a medieval cathedral's proportional design being negotiated on the worksite by professional builders. The most famous surviving evidence of how this was done sits in the French National Library in Paris. The sketchbook of Villard de Honnecourt, drawn between 1225 and 1235, is roughly 40 pages of medieval architectural geometry. 6 of those pages document Reims Cathedral. Villard drew rose windows, vault sections, tower elevations, and full-size profiles using compass and straight edge alone. This is what made the banker mason indispensable. Once the master had drawn the lines on the tracing floor, the banker mason cut the stones to those exact templates. Stones arrived at the wall pre-fitted. The masons on the scaffold were not cutting stones in place. They were lifting stones whose shape had been settled before any of them was raised an inch off the ground. That is why the joints on surviving Gothic masonry are so tight. Every block is a piece of a puzzle whose shape had been decided in plaster a week before it ever saw daylight. By the time a mason reached the rank of master, he had been on building sites for 20 years. He had survived an apprenticeship, a wanderjahr, and a journeyman period of usually 3 to 4 years. He had cut stones for a dozen cathedrals across 2 or 3 countries, and he had buried colleagues. Falls were the most common cause of death. The scaffolds were timber lashed together with rope, and they had to be moved up the wall as the building rose. A 90-foot drop onto a flagstone floor is not survivable. Gervais of Canterbury's account of William of Sens is one of dozens of similar incidents in cathedral fabric records. The Beauvais Cathedral in northern France saw the choir vaults collapse in 1284, 12 years after they were keyed into place. Builders had pushed them too high. The collapse killed people on site. The work was also seasonal, in a way modern construction is not. Frost shatters lime mortar. Mortar that has not cured fully will crack the moment ice forms in its pores. Every cathedral lodge in Northern Europe shut its scaffolds down between roughly St. Martin's Day in November and Easter. The masons who had been working through the year were laid off. They went home, or they walked to a lodge in the south, or they slept in a brother lodge on charity through the winter. There was no winter work. There was also no winter pay. By the end of the 14th century, the lodges across the Holy Roman Empire were operating under coordinated rules, standardized training, standardized assessments, cross-recognition of journeyman papers. A mason qualified in Cologne could walk into the lodge at Vienna and be put to work the same week. On the 25th of April, 1459, 17 cathedral master builders from across the empire met at Regensburg to formalize what they already practiced. Strasbourg, Vienna, Basel, Cologne, and 13 other lodges sent delegates. Jodocus Dotzinger, master of the Strasbourg Lodge, led the Congress. The ordinances they signed that week are the earliest surviving written training standard for the craft. They were revised and re-signed at Strasbourg in 1563. By the time the ink dried on the second version, the system had less than 100 years to live. In 1517, Martin Luther had nailed 95 theses to a church door in Wittenberg. By the 1530s, the monasteries and cathedral chapters that had paid the lodges for 4 centuries were being dissolved across Northern Europe. Henry VIII dissolved the English monasteries between 1536 and 1541. Cathedral fabric funds collapsed. Pilgrim revenue, which had paid for many of the great projects, dried up. Indulgence income evaporated almost overnight. The lodges emptied. Apprentices had no masters to learn from because the masters had no commissions to train them on. The continuous chain of technique that had been passed mouth to mouth on scaffolds for 400 years was broken in one generation. The English Civil War from 1642 to 1651 finished what the Reformation had started. By the late 17th century, what had been working cathedral lodges across Europe was something else: social fraternities, speculative Freemasonry, the memory of a craft that no longer built anything. The cathedrals are still standing. The men who knew how to build them are not. What we lost when the lodges emptied was not just a craft. It was a system. Apprentice to journeyman to master, mouth to mouth, mark to mark. 400 years without a break. A cathedral mason in 1500 knew what a cathedral mason in 1100 had figured out by hand, because the system was designed to lose nothing. When the kings dissolved the monasteries and the patronage ended, that system did not stop teaching gradually. It stopped teaching in one generation. The cathedrals are still standing. The knowledge of how to build them at that scale with those tools disappeared. If you found this valuable, hit that like button and subscribe. We investigate forgotten knowledge that the modern world left behind. Drop a comment and tell us which part of the medieval mason's life surprised you most. The 5-year apprenticeship without wages, the Wanderjahr on foot, the mark that became the contract, or the way the whole system collapsed in a single generation when the patronage ended. We read every comment. Until next time, build to last.